Installing drag chains on the original and Pro Series Onefinity CNC. Our first thing we're going to do is going to be removing the two bolts on the back side of the X rail or the left side of the Y rail, depending on which rail you're working on. We're going to replace those bolts with the two longer silver bolts that are included with the drag chain kits. With those bolts threaded through those holes, we're going to put a nut on each of them to retain the motor. We'll tighten that down with our 4mm hex key and our 8mm wrench, and now we are ready for our black plastic mounting bracket for our drag chain raceway. That will slide over the two bolts that we have just installed as well as those nuts. Then we will use another 8mm locking nut to hold that in place. Again, we'll use our 4mm hex key and our 8mm wrench to tighten that down in place, just enough to hold it. We don't want to over tighten and crack that plastic. With that secured to the rail, we can use a 3mm hex key to remove the two smaller silver bolts that we will use to lock the drag chain raceway in place later. Now we can move to the front of the rail, or the left side of the rail if it's the X-axis, and we can install the bracket to hold the opposite end of the drag chain raceway using the two silver bolts that are included in the packaging. We'll use a 4mm hex key to tighten these down, and again, be careful, we don't want to over tighten and crack the plastic. With that installed, we can now slide our drag chain raceway into the cutout of the bracket that we've just mounted on the left side of our X rail or the front of our Y1 rail. Back on the motor end of the rail, we can just set our drag chain raceway into the little crook there, and we'll use those 3mm bolts that we removed a minute ago to secure it into place. Now that our drag chain raceway is fully installed, we can go to installing our drag chains themselves. Back on the end opposite the motor, we will use a 2.5mm hex key to remove the two small silver bolts that will hold the drag chain to the drag chain raceway. Now with those bolts removed, we can simply lay our drag chain into the raceway. You'll also notice there are two countersunk holes in the end piece of the drag chain itself for those bolts to go into, holding it to the raceway. From here, we'll use a 2.5mm hex key to tighten those in place, making sure we don't over tighten and crack the plastic. The next thing we're going to do after installing our drag chain is we are going to install our X1Z1 clip or our Z2 clip. Now all these do is retain our wires on the end of the rail for us, making sure everything is nice and neat. But you'll notice that there is a bit of an extra space around the wire itself. Now to fix this, we have two small spacers that will fit in there with the wire, and they will actually index with the inside of that housing, making sure that everything is locked in place. Here you can see that there's a lip on one end of it, and that will index with the line that is inside of that housing. So here I'm just lining up that little lip with the indent inside of that housing, and you'll actually be able to feel it almost click into place when you get it seated correctly. Now you can see both of those are in place, and we're going to put the other half of our Z2 clip on top, and we will use the included 4mm bolt to secure that together. Now that we've got one end of the drag chain wire secured, let's secure the other. We're going to go to the opposite end of the rail, and we're actually going to be working on the back side of the gantry block. I'm going to pull that gantry block closer to the end of the rail to make it easier to work on. Here we have our drag chain bracket that will go on the back of your X or Y gantry, and we'll use a 3mm hex key to tighten down the included bolt that will come in the packaging with it, just to lock that down in place. Make sure that you seat that well and don't over tighten and crack the plastic. We have two more steps. First is going to be to snap that drag chain into that bracket. It will just push right into place and lock itself in there. And after we've done that, we'll use a 4mm hex key to loosen the bolts on the top plate of our X-axis gantry. And we're going to put our Z-axis cable through there so that we can plug into our Z slider. This will lock that in place and keep our cables organized so that everything stays out of the way of the Z slider. That completes installing drag chains on the Onefinity CNC.